It is, Marie. These charges coming down just in the last 30 minutes or so. The Will County Sheriff's Office confirms it has obtained an arrest warrant for 30-year-old Jenna Strouble of St. John, Indiana, and she faces 9 counts of first-degree murder. And the Sheriff's Office says that this was a targeted incident. We have some video that we collected from yesterday showing the scene out here. This was on East Norway Trail in Crete. Deputies arrived here about 2 a.m. on Monday for a welfare check. And inside a home here, they found the bodies of Stacy Forde, her husband Patrick Forde, and their 32-year-old son, Jacob Lambert. Deputies say that Strouble fled the scene and was taken into custody. And during interviews with investigators, the Sheriff's Office says that she gave incriminating statements. They say they also recovered a handgun that was matched to one that was believed to be used in the killings. Lambert was found dead in his car in the driveway, the Sheriff's Office says. His parents were found inside the home. The Sheriff's Office says that Strouble had an on-off relationship with Lambert, and they had kids together. The Sheriff's Office also tells me that deputies were called to this house here in January of 2025 for domestic battery and a mental health intervention. They say that Strouble was also involuntarily committed during that incident in January of 2025. She's being held right now in Indiana, and she's expected to be brought back to Illinois to face those charges. That's the latest information we have at this point, and of course we'll pass along more as we learn it out here in Crete. For now, reporting live in Crete, Noel Brennan, CBS News, Chicago. Marie?
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. On Tuesday, March 24th, the Will County Sheriff's Office announced in a post on Facebook that Jenna Strouble, 30, of St. John, Indiana, had been arrested on 9 counts of first-degree murder. Authorities said the arrest was in connection to the triple homicide that took place in unincorporated Crete on Monday. Grief is a quiet weight that settles upon the heart long before the mind can find the words to describe it. A reminder that the bonds we weave in life are as fragile as they are profound. We find ourselves tonight in the expansive, softly rolling landscapes of Will County, Illinois, specifically within the quiet, unincorporated stretches of Crete Township. It is a place where the horizon seems to stretch a little further, where the air carries the scent of damp earth and the rustle of dormant corn husks in the late March breeze. The world here feels still, as if the land itself is exhaling a long, slow breath under the cover of a cool, indigo sky. In a home that should have been a sanctuary of shared meals and quiet conversations, there lived a family who found their rhythm in the simple, grounding routines of everyday life. Patrick Forde, a man of 55, was someone who likely knew the particular creak of his floorboards and the way the morning light hit the kitchen table. His wife, Stacy, at 54, was a woman who anchored the household with a presence that spoke of decades of shared history and a deep, abiding connection to her husband. Living with them was their 32-year-old son, Jacob Lambert, a man whose life was inextricably tied to his parents and the children he was raising, navigating the complexities of parenthood and the delicate shifting tides of a long-term relationship. The silence of this rural community is usually only broken by the distant hum of a passing car or the rhythmic chirpings of crickets. Yet, on the early morning of Monday, March 23rd, the stillness held a different, heavier quality. There is a specific kind of peace that settles over a home in the hours before dawn, a time when the world feels suspended in a state of soft, velvet-like potential. Within the walls of the Forde residence, the mundane details of life were scattered about. Perhaps a half-read book on a nightstand, a pair of shoes left by the door, or the faint, lingering aroma of a Sunday dinner. These are the anchors of our existence, the small sensory proofs that we belong to a place and to each other. The investigation would later reveal that this domestic landscape, so carefully cultivated over years of shared laughter and quiet resilience, was about to be irrevocably altered. It was at approximately 2 a.m. that the veil of privacy was lifted, not by the rising sun, but by the flickering blue and red lights of authority. A concerned family member, feeling that intuitive pull of unease that often precedes the realization of loss, had requested a welfare check, a simple act of love that would lead to the discovery of a profound and hollow silence. As we look back at that night, we see the officers arriving at the property, their footsteps muffled by the grass, their flashlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a scene that had already passed from action into history. In the driveway, sitting within the familiar confines of a vehicle, they found Jacob Lambert. He was a man who, in the prime of his life, had been at the center of a complicated web of affection and responsibility. The car, usually a vessel for movement and progress, had become a static marker of a life interrupted. Moving toward the house, the officers entered a space where the air was still and the shadows long. Inside, on the first floor near the front door, they discovered Patrick and Stacy Forde. The proximity to the entrance suggested a life lived with an open heart, a home where the door was a threshold for family and friends. The Fordes were a couple who had reached the age where one begins to see the fruits of their labor, the steady growth of children and the promise of a quiet retirement. Their presence near the door was a poignant reminder of the hospitality and warmth they likely offered to those they loved, a final, silent testament to a life built on the foundations of partnership and care. The detectives who would eventually take over the scene were faced with a landscape of echoes, where every object told a story of what had been lost. They moved with a practiced, respectful calm, documenting the stillness and the way the light from their lamps glinted off the surfaces of a home that had suddenly become a monument to a triple tragedy. There is a heavy, almost tangible quality to a space where life has suddenly departed, a feeling that the very walls are holding on to the memories of voices and footsteps that will never return. The investigation was not a race, but a careful, methodical reconstruction of a series of moments that led to this singular, devastating conclusion. In those early hours, the focus was on the geography of the home, the car in the driveway, the entryway where a mother and father lay, mapping out the final movements of a family that had been together just hours before. The wind continued to blow across the fields of Crete, indifferent to the shifting reality within the house, while the officers outside maintained a perimeter of quiet vigilance. Information began to drift in, as it always does, like autumn leaves settling on a still pond. We learned that Jacob had shared children with a woman named Jenna Strouble, a 32-year-old from Crete, John, Indiana, located just a short 8-mile drive across the state line. Their relationship was described as being on and off, a common enough rhythm in the modern world, filled with the peaks and valleys of shared history and the ongoing negotiation of co-parenting. In the quiet of her Indiana home, just a 10-minute drive away, the world was likely just as still as it was in Crete. This proximity is a grounding detail, A reminder that the lives we lead are often separated by only a few miles of road and a handful of decisions. The detectives, working through the night and into the following day, were able to trace a path through the silence, eventually identifying Jenna as a person of interest. By Tuesday, March 24th, the Will County Sheriff's Office would announce her arrest on 9 counts of first-degree murder, a development that brought a formal name to the tragedy, but did little to fill the void left behind in the Forde household. The process of justice is often a slow, deliberate unwinding of events, a movement toward a clarity that can never truly undo the past. When Strouble was interviewed, she reportedly gave incriminating statements, providing the investigators with the pieces they needed to assemble the narrative of that Monday morning. A firearm was recovered, a physical object that served as a grim link between the two locations, its presence a cold, hard fact in an otherwise ethereal story of loss. The ballistic evidence matched the one used in the killings, providing a technical certainty to the investigation. Throughout this process, the tone of the authorities remained one of solemn duty, a recognition that while an arrest provides a path forward for the legal system, it offers only a small, distant comfort to those who are grieving. The Sheriff's Office expressed their gratitude to the St. John Police and the Lake County Sheriff's Office, a collaborative effort that spoke to the interconnectedness of these communities and the shared commitment to restoring a sense of order to a world that had been momentarily upended. As the sun sets over the fields of Crete, and the lights begin to twinkle in the windows of homes in Street John, we are reminded that the stories we tell are often ways of making sense of the unthinkable. We reflect on the lives of Patrick, Stacy, and Jacob, not as names in a police report, but as people who once breathed the cool Illinois air and looked forward to the coming spring. The memory of the smell of old wood in the Forde home, the sound of a car door closing in the driveway, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the mantel all serve as mundane anchors, keeping the weight of the tragedy from drifting away into abstraction. We are left with the image of a family whose history was rooted in the soil of this quiet township, a history that is now a part of the landscape's long and silent memory. The danger has passed into the archives of the court. The scene has been cleared, and the silence has returned to the rolling hills of Will County. It is a time for reflection, for honoring the quiet strength of those who were lost, and for finding peace in the knowledge that the night eventually gives way to the stillness of a memory that remains safe and unchanging. You are secure in the present, far from the echoes of that Monday morning, and it is now time to let the weight of the day fade into the soft, velvet embrace of sleep. The cold air of that Monday morning in Crete Township held a stillness that seemed to press against the windows of the Forde family home. At approximately 2 a.m., the typical silence of the rural landscape was not broken by the sounds of the natural world, but by a sudden, jarring displacement of peace. The driveway of the residence, which usually served as a simple passage for the coming and going of daily life, became the first sight of a profound and heavy silence. It was here that 32-year-old Jacob Lambert was found, resting within the familiar confines of a vehicle. The car, a metal shell meant for transition and travel, had become a final stationary point in a life that was deeply intertwined with the two people sleeping just a few yards away inside the house. To understand the weight of this moment, we must look at the geography of the scene. The Forde residence sat as a sanctuary of sorts, a place where Patrick and Stacy Forde, aged 55 and 54, had built a life centered on family and the quiet rhythms of the township. The transition from the driveway to the front door was a short walk, a path likely trodden thousands of times with groceries, mail, and the laughter of grandchildren. Yet, on this particular night, that path was marked by a sequence of events that the local authorities would later describe as targeted and deliberate. When the Will County Sheriff's deputies arrived for the welfare check, requested by a concerned family member whose intuition had begun to signal that something was wrong, they moved through the darkness with a cautious respect for the surrounding neighborhood. The air was crisp, the kind of late March chill that lingers before the true arrival of spring. As they approached the front door, they discovered the bodies of Patrick and Stacy. They were found on the first floor, positioned near the entrance, suggesting that the sanctuary of their home had been breached in the most direct way possible. There was no evidence of a struggle that had moved through the house. Instead, the tragedy seemed concentrated, a brief and heavy occurrence that left the rest of the home in a state of frozen domesticity. The smell of the old wood in the flooring and the faint scent of a home recently settled for the night remained, contrasting sharply with the sterile reality the investigators now faced. In the hours that followed, the focus of the investigation shifted 8 miles to the east, across the state line into St. John, Indiana. This was where 30-year-old Jenna Strouble resided. The distance between the two homes was a mere 15-minute drive, a route that connected the lives of these two families through the shared history of Jacob and Jenna's children. This proximity serves as a reminder of how closely our lives are often tethered to those who may harbor the deepest complexities. The Lake County Sheriff's Office and the St. John Police Department worked in seamless coordination with Illinois officials, moving through the pre-dawn hours to locate Strouble at her residence. As the sun began to cast a pale light over the Indiana suburbs, the investigation moved into a phase of careful documentation. A firearm was recovered, a cold piece of machinery that would later be confirmed through forensic analysis as the match for the one used in Crete. During the subsequent interviews, the tone of the room was reported as heavy, filled with the gravity of the statements being made. Detectives listened as incriminating details emerged, piecing together a timeline that stretched from the quiet driveway in Illinois to the suburban streets of Indiana. The 9 counts of first-degree murder leveled against Strouble were not just legal designations, but markers of the scale of the loss. 3 lives, 3 generations of a family tree, severed in a single, localized event. We find ourselves looking back at this not with the adrenaline of a chase, but with the somber realization that the safety we feel in our homes is a precious, shared agreement, one that remained intact for the rest of the community, even as it was tragically lost for the Forde family. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, so before we begin, I'd love for you to let me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Let's get comfortable. Let the weight of the day drift away and settle into the quiet. Tonight, we look at a tragedy in Crete, Illinois. A story of a family lost, but also of the swift hand of justice that followed in the early hours of a March morning. The geography of unincorporated Crete is a landscape of transition. In the quiet stretches of Will County, the silence of the night is usually a comfort, a blanket that covers the farmsteads and the winding roads. In late March, the Midwest is caught between the freezing grip of winter and the messy, hopeful arrival of spring. It is a time when the ground is often saturated, the smell of damp earth rising as the frost begins its final retreat. At 2 a.m., the air is heavy with a specific kind of stillness, and a thick fog often rolls in to sit atop the flat Illinois fields, obscuring the distant lights of the small towns that dot the horizon. In these unincorporated areas, the homes are spaced far apart, separated by dark woodlots and wide, dormant pastures. There are no city sirens here, no hum of traffic to break the peace. On this particular Monday morning, the atmosphere was one of profound solitude. The Forde family home sat nestled in this rural quietude, a place where the darkness feels absolute. When the clock struck 2, the only movement was the slow drift of mist across the gravel driveways. It is in this environment, one of deep rhythmic silence, that the events we are discussing tonight unfolded, changing the legacy of a family forever while the rest of the county remained tucked away in their beds, unaware of the shift in the air. The layout of the Forde property in Crete Township was designed for the kind of quiet, multi-generational living that many strive for, featuring a modest but well-kept home and a driveway that stretched back from the main road, shielded by a line of sleeping trees. To understand the gravity of that Monday morning, we must look at the physical space where the lives of Jacob, Stacy, and Patrick converged for the final time. The driveway was not merely a path to the garage. It was where the first sign of something gone terribly wrong would be discovered by the responding deputies. In the deep stillness of 2 a.m., the air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and dormant grass. When the Will County Sheriff's deputies arrived for the requested welfare check, they didn't find a scene of chaos or a house in disarray. Instead, they found a chillingly static tableau. It began in the driveway, where Jacob Lambert's vehicle sat as if he had just arrived or was moments away from leaving. Inside that car, the 32-year-old father was found unresponsive, the victim of a targeted and violent act that left the interior of the vehicle silent. There was no struggle that woke the neighbors, no sound that pierced the heavy veil of the Crete night. The investigation would later reveal that the violence had been swift, leaving the car as a steel tomb under the moonlight. Leaving the driveway, the deputies moved toward the front door of the residence, where the porch light likely cast a pale, steady glow on the welcome mat. Inside, just beyond the threshold on the first floor, lay the bodies of Stacy and Patrick Forde. The proximity of the parents to the front door suggests a tragic sequence of events, perhaps a reaction to a sound outside, or a final attempt to see who was at their home at such an hour. They were found in the very place where they had likely welcomed their son and grandchildren countless times before. The interior of the home remained warm, the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, perhaps the only sound remaining in a space that had, only hours prior, been a sanctuary of family life. As the deputies secured the perimeter, the gravity of the triple homicide began to settle over the scene. This was not a random act of a passing stranger, but a deeply personal tragedy. The transition from a quiet welfare check to a triple murder investigation happened in the span of a few heartbeats. While the investigators moved through the rooms, noting the mundane details of a life interrupted, a half-finished book perhaps, or shoes kicked off by the door, the focus shifted 8 miles away to St. John, Indiana. It was there, in a neighboring state, that the mother of Jacob's children, Jenna Strouble, was residing. The silence of the night was about to be replaced by the methodical, synchronized efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies working to piece together how an on and off relationship could result in such a devastating loss. The silence of that Monday morning, March 23rd, was not merely a lack of sound, but a heavy, expectant stillness that often precedes a life-altering revelation. At approximately 2 a.m., while most of Will County lay in a deep, restorative sleep, the quiet was fractured by the sharp ring of a telephone at the sheriff's office. A concerned family member was on the other end of the line, their voice likely strained by that peculiar, cold intuition that something had gone terribly wrong. It was a request for a welfare check, a task that police officers perform hundreds of times a year, usually ending with a sigh of relief or a simple explanation for a missed call. Yet, as the patrol cars began their journey toward the rural stretches of Crete Township, the atmosphere felt markedly different. The drive was a slow, methodical progression through dark, winding streets where the reach of the city's glow begins to fail. In this part of the township, the houses sit back from the road, separated by wide patches of grass and the skeletal silhouettes of trees that, in late March, have yet to reclaim their leaves. The headlights of the squad cars cut through the gloom, reflecting off the occasional mailbox or the metallic glint of a fence. There was no traffic to contend with, no witnesses to their arrival, only the rhythmic crunch of tires over the occasional patch of gravel. The officers approached the residence with the professional detachment required of the job, though the isolation of the property always adds a layer of heightened awareness to such midnight calls. As the home came into view, it appeared at first to be just another sleeping residence, its windows dark and its inhabitants presumably at rest. However, as the patrol cars pulled to a stop and the flashing red and blue lights were activated, the scene was transformed. The strobing lights bounced off the siding of the house and the glass of the windows, creating a frantic, artificial heartbeat against the steady backdrop of the night. The officers stepped out into the cool air, the smell of damp earth and dormant grass filling their senses. It was in this moment, under the rhythmic pulse of the emergency lights, that the routine nature of the check began to dissolve. The transition from a standard inquiry to a nightmarish discovery happens in the small, quiet details. Perhaps it was the way a car was positioned in the driveway, or the unnatural silence that greeted their knock at the door. We find ourselves standing there with them, feeling the shift in energy as the officers realized that the concerned family member had been right to call. The heavy stillness of Crete Township was about to be broken by a reality that no one in that quiet neighborhood could have prepared for. As the flashlights began to sweep the property, the beams caught something in the driveway, a sight that would ensure this 2 a.m. call would never be forgotten. The investigation was now officially beginning, shifting from a search for wellness to a documentation of tragedy. Not long after the first boots hit the pavement, the true scale of the loss began to emerge, as the officers realized they weren't just looking for one person, but three. The quiet home, once a sanctuary for a man and his parents, was now a cordoned-off perimeter where the shadows of the past few hours were finally being brought into the light. But as the officers moved toward the vehicle idling in the dark, they had no way of knowing that the person responsible was already miles away, crossing state lines back into the relative safety of her own home. The officers stepped onto the driveway of the Forde residence, their boots crunching softly against the damp gravel that lined the path to the home. It was the early hours of March 23rd, and the air held that biting, lingering chill characteristic of late winter in Illinois. A thin mist seemed to hang over the unincorporated area of Crete, muffling the sounds of the distant highway and wrapping the property in a heavy, expectant silence. Under the amber glow of the porch lights and the occasional sweep of a flashlight, the scene initially seemed almost mundane, a quiet tableau of a suburban night that had not yet revealed its secrets to the arriving deputies. The gravel crunched underfoot, a rhythmic grounding sound that contrasted with the unsettling stillness of the dark sedan parked several yards from the front door. As the officers approached the vehicle, the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the gloom, reflecting off the cold glass of the driver's side window. Inside, the silhouette of a man remained perfectly motionless, his head tilted slightly as if he had simply pulled into the driveway and decided to rest for a moment before heading inside. This was 32-year-old Jacob Lambert. To a casual observer, the scene might have looked like a weary father returning home after a long shift, perhaps catching a few minutes of quiet before the responsibilities of the household took over. But the responders noticed the small clinical details that stripped away any hope of a peaceful slumber. There was no rising and falling of the chest, no fog of breath on the window despite the biting March air, and no reaction to the sharp rap of a knuckle against the glass. The car was a tomb of metal and glass, sitting silently on the familiar stones of his parents' property. The deputies moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, their movements slow and deliberate to preserve the integrity of what they now realized was a crime scene. They documented the position of the car, noted the way the keys remained in the ignition, and observed the devastating reality of the injuries Jacob had sustained. There is a specific kind of silence that descends upon a first responder in these moments, a professional detachment that allows them to process the unthinkable without losing their footing. They looked at the house, then back at the car, realizing that the sanctuary of the Forde family home had been breached in the most violent way imaginable. Jacob was a man who shared children with Jenna Strouble, a man whose life was intertwined with the very woman who would later be accused of ending it. In the stillness of that driveway, surrounded by the mundane items of a life in progress, perhaps a stray coffee cup in the console or a child's toy in the back seat, the weight of the tragedy began to settle. He was only 8 miles from where his children were likely sleeping, yet he was worlds away, lost to a darkness that had followed him onto the gravel he had driven over 1,000 times before. The investigation would eventually piece together the trajectory of the bullets and the timing of the encounter. But in those first few minutes, there was only the cold wind and the haunting sight of a young father who would never make it to the front door. The safety of the family home, a concept so central to our sense of peace, had been irrevocably shattered. As the deputies turned their attention toward the house, their flashlights illuminating the path Stacy and Patrick Forde had walked every day, the true scale of the loss began to emerge from the shadows of the Illinois night. The officers prepared themselves to enter the residence, knowing that the silence inside likely held the same grim resolution they had found in the driveway. The transition from the open air to the confined space of the home marked a new phase of the night, one where the whispers of the past would soon be drowned out by the cold, hard facts of the present. The front door stood before them, a final barrier between the quiet of the exterior and the tragedy that awaited within the walls of the Forde home. The handle of the front door turned with a heavy metallic click that seemed to echo across the silent yard, vibrating through the wood and into the gloved hands of the responding deputies. As the door swung inward, the transition was immediate. From the crisp, biting air of a late March night in Crete Township to the stagnant, unmoving atmosphere of a home that had suddenly lost its pulse. There was no sign of a forced entry, no splintered wood or shattered glass to suggest a frantic struggle against an intruder. Instead, the threshold felt like a boundary between two different worlds. The chaotic scene in the driveway they had just left, and the eerie, preserved stillness of the foyer. The layout of the first floor was typical of a well-loved family residence, designed for comfort and the easy flow of daily life. To the left, a living area held the soft shapes of furniture in the shadows. To the right, perhaps a dining space where memories of shared meals still lingered in the scent of lemon wax and old upholstery. But as the beams of the flashlights cut through the darkness, they did not find the mundane clutter of a Sunday evening. Instead, they illuminated the unmistakable evidence of a life interrupted. Near the front door, as if they had been moving toward the sound of the commotion outside or perhaps greeting someone they recognized, lay the bodies of Stacy and Patrick Forde. Stacy Forde, 54 years old, was a woman whose life was woven into the fabric of this house. In the dim light, the investigators saw a person who had likely spent her evening in the quiet comfort of her own four walls, never imagining that the sanctuary she had built would become a site of such profound violence. Beside her was her husband, 55-year-old Patrick Forde. They were a couple who had reached the age where life should have been settling into a predictable, peaceful rhythm, a time for watching children grow and enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work. To see them there, stilled in the very heart of their home, was to witness the abrupt end of a shared history that had spanned over half a century for each of them. The scene was clinical in its efficiency, which made it all the more chilling for the officers processing the room. There were no drawers pulled out, no jewelry boxes overturned, and no electronics missing from their stands. This was not a robbery gone wrong or the work of a panicked thief. The targeted nature of the incident was written in the very placement of the victims. It was a scene of grim intentionality, suggesting that whoever had entered this home did not come for possessions, but for the people within. The lack of random chaos pointed toward a dark, personal connection, a chilling realization that the threat had not come from the world outside, but from someone who knew exactly where to find them. The silence in the Forde home was not merely the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against their ears. In a family home, there are usually constant, subtle reminders of life. The hum of a refrigerator, the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, the distant groan of floorboards settling as the temperature drops. But as the investigators moved through the first floor, those sounds felt like relics of a distant past. The clock on the wall continued its steady march, its mechanical heart oblivious to the fact that for Stacy and Patrick, time had reached a permanent standstill. The contrast between the ticking hand and the motionless figures on the floor created a haunting dissonance, a reminder of how quickly the vibrant energy of a household can be extinguished. As they moved deeper into the residence, checking the kitchen and the peripheral rooms of the lower level, the sense of a life paused became even more acute. A pair of glasses left on a side table, a book with a bookmark tucked halfway through a chapter, a half-empty glass of water. These mundane anchors of existence took on a ghostly quality. Each object was a testament to a plan for a tomorrow that would never arrive. The kitchen, usually the warm center of a home, felt cold and sterile under the glare of tactical lights. Everything was in its place, perfectly ordered, highlighting the surgical precision of the tragedy that had unfolded. The investigation was only in its earliest, most fragile hours, yet the weight of the loss was already palpable. The deputies knew that beyond these walls, a community was still sleeping, unaware that 3 lives had been snuffed out in a single, coordinated act of violence. The first floor of the Forde home had transformed from a place of refuge into a meticulously preserved crime scene, a grim gallery of a family's final moments. As the forensics teams began their slow, methodical work of documenting the position of every shell casing and the angle of every shadow, the heavy silence of the house remained, a silent witness to a betrayal that had yet to be fully understood. To understand the chilling proximity of this tragedy, one must look at the geography of a life once shared, a map where the lines of love and resentment were drawn across a mere 8 miles of Midwestern pavement. Jenna Strouble lived in St. John, Indiana, a community known for its quiet subdivisions and the silver-gray light that settles over the Lake County fields in the early spring. At 30 years old, her life was inextricably woven into the fabric of the Forde family through the most permanent of bonds, the children she shared with Jacob Lambert. These children were the living legacy of a relationship that had spent years flickering like a candle in a drafty room, constantly moving between the warmth of reconciliation and the cold silence of separation. Jacob was 32, a man whose life was centered around the family home in unincorporated Crete, Illinois. The drive between his driveway and Jenna's front door was a short, unremarkable journey that took less than 15 minutes, cutting through the invisible border where Illinois dissolves into Indiana. It was a route they had both driven hundreds of times, to drop off car seats, to exchange holiday plans, or perhaps to attempt one more conversation to fix what had long been broken. This small stretch of road, lined with dormant trees and the steady hum of distant highway traffic, served as the umbilical cord for a family trying to navigate the complexities of an on-off romance. In the quiet corners of St. John, Jenna's life appeared as many others did, anchored by the mundane routines of parenthood and the soft glow of a television screen in the evening. Yet, beneath the surface of this suburban stillness, the shared history between her and Jacob was becoming a weight too heavy to carry. Friends and family would later reflect on the nature of their bond, describing it as a cycle of deep connection followed by sharp withdrawals. It was a shared life that had seen the birth of children and the celebration of milestones, making the eventual transition to a shared ending all the more incomprehensible. The Forde home in Crete was not just a crime scene. It was the place where Jacob's parents, Stacy and Patrick, had cultivated a sanctuary for their son and grandchildren. They were the stabilizing force in a turbulent dynamic, the ones who provided a sense of continuity when the relationship between Jenna and Jacob faltered. The proximity of the two homes meant that the grandparents were never more than a few minutes away from the children they adored. It was a life of shared Sunday dinners, of toys scattered across the lawn, and of the rhythmic ticking of the clock in a house that believed it was safe. As the investigation would eventually reveal, that 8-mile stretch of road would become the path of a final, fatal journey. The tragedy lies in the intimacy of the geography. The fact that the person who knew the layout of the Forde kitchen and the sound of the front door's latch was the same person now accused of silencing the house forever. The history they built together, the shared jokes, the private struggles, and the mutual investment in the next generation, did not act as a shield, but rather as a map that led directly to the midnight hours of March 23rd. The silence that now permeates the 8 miles between street. John and Crete is a heavy, reflective one. It is the silence of a narrative that has reached its final tragic chapter, leaving behind a legacy of children who must now grow up in the shadow of a history that ended where it began, on a short drive home across state lines. The path from the Forde residence in Crete, Illinois, to the quiet suburban streets of St. John, Indiana, is a distance of roughly 8 miles, a mere 15-minute drive under normal circumstances. In the pre-dawn hours of Monday, March 23rd, this stretch of road was a landscape of deep shadows and biting late winter air. As Jenna Strouble steered her vehicle away from the driveway where Jacob Lambert lay still in his car, and away from the home where Patrick and Stacy Forde had just seen their final moments, the world around her remained profoundly indifferent to the gravity of the event. The local geography here is a tapestry of flat, sprawling fields and intermittent clusters of trees that stand like silent sentinels against the night sky. To an outside observer, the vehicle moving along these back roads would have seemed like any other commuter or late-night traveler. Yet the interior of that car held a heavy, suffocating reality. The route requires crossing the state line, a transition that usually feels significant. Yet on this night, the border between Illinois and Indiana was nothing more than a signpost passing in the dark. There is a haunting contrast in this movement. While the 3 victims remained in a state of absolute eternal stillness in Crete, the person allegedly responsible was in a state of frantic mechanical motion. The humming of tires on asphalt and the rhythmic flicker of passing streetlights provided a stark, clinical backdrop to a journey fueled by the unthinkable. By 2 a.m., St. John, Indiana, was draped in the heavy velvet of sleep. It is a community known for its manicured lawns and the kind of safety that allows residents to rest without locking every window. As Strouble arrived back at her residence, the neighborhood was a picture of suburban peace. The air was likely crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the dormant gardens of early spring. There is something deeply unsettling about the mundane details of a return home. The turning of a key, the shutting of a car door, the soft glow of a porch light, when contrasted with the violence left behind just 8 miles away. While the Forde family home was soon to be illuminated by the harsh, strobing blues and reds of emergency lights, Strouble's home remained a pocket of deceptive normalcy. The investigation into these movements began almost immediately after the welfare check at 2 a.m. revealed the tragedy. While the scene in Crete was being processed, detectives began the meticulous work of digital and physical tracking. In the modern era, a flight of 8 miles leaves a breadcrumb trail that is difficult to erase. Investigators utilized a combination of neighborhood surveillance footage, license plate readers, and cellular data to reconstruct the timeline of that Monday morning. They looked for the ghost of a vehicle moving through the intersection of Exchange Street or cutting across the quiet state line roads. Every camera passed was a witness that did not sleep. Every cell tower ping was a timestamp in a digital ledger. By Tuesday, March 24th, the evidence had coalesced into a clear directive. The path led directly back to the residence in St. John. The quick response of the St. John Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff's Office ensured that the transition from investigation to apprehension was swift. There was no grand chase, no cinematic standoff, only the cold, hard realization of a trail followed to its conclusion. The stillness that Strouble had sought in her Indiana home was finally broken by the arrival of authorities, marking the end of the 8-mile flight and the beginning of a long journey through the halls of justice. The silence of the victims remained, but the silence of the suspects' movements had been replaced by the loud, undeniable facts of the forensic trail. The transition from the open road to the confined, sterile environment of an interrogation room marks a profound shift in the energy of this investigation. As Jenna Strouble was brought into the custody of the Will County Sheriff's Office, the frantic movements of the previous hours were replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. The interview room itself was a study in clinical simplicity, a small space where the air seemed thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and the faint, metallic tang of old coffee. There was no grand drama in these early moments. only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that served as a constant reminder of the time that had passed since the quiet of the Forde residence had been shattered. Detectives sat across from Jenna, their voices lowered to a calm, professional hum that was designed to steady the nerves and encourage the flow of information. It is in these quiet exchanges that the most significant breakthroughs often occur, far from the flashing lights of the crime scene. During these lengthy sessions, the narrative began to shift from a series of external observations to an internal accounting of the night's events. The silence was eventually broken by what authorities described as incriminating statements provided by Jenna herself. These were not whispered secrets, but rather the slow, methodical unspooling of a story that linked her directly to the tragic scenes in Crete Township. As she spoke, the reality of the situation began to solidify into a formal legal structure. The investigation, which had started with a simple welfare check at 2 a.m, now culminated in a clinical breakdown of the charges. The weight of the law manifested in the announcement of 9 counts of first-degree murder. To the layperson, 9 counts for 3 victims might seem like a mathematical curiosity, but in the realm of justice, it represents a multifaceted approach to the act of taking a life. It accounts for the intent, the manner of the act, and the specific circumstances surrounding each of the 3 souls lost: Jacob, Stacy, and Patrick. There is a particular kind of gravity that settles over a room when the truth finally surfaces in its entirety. It is the weight of finality, the moment where alleged begins to transform into admitted, and the chaotic why starts to find its grim how. The detectives listened as the details of the on and off relationship and the shared history between Jenna and Jacob were mapped out against the timeline of the shootings. Every word spoken in that room was a stitch in a growing tapestry of evidence, a narrative that moved from the driveway where a car sat idle to the front door where a family's safety had been breached. The emotional beat of this chapter is found in that very realization that the mystery of the night had been replaced by the cold, hard facts of a confession. The investigators, having worked through the exhaustion of the early morning hours, found themselves holding the pieces of a broken family's story, now bound by the legal necessity of those 9 counts. The soft voices of the interviewers continued, documenting the history of the firearm and the movements across the state line, ensuring that every incriminating statement was anchored to a physical reality. It was here, in the dim light of the station, that the flight ended and the accountability began. As the interviews concluded and the statements were transcribed, the focus of the investigation turned toward the physical manifestations of the words spoken. The story now required the one piece of evidence that would bridge the gap between a confession and a conviction. We move now from the heavy atmosphere of the interview room to the search for the instrument of this tragedy, as the investigation leads us toward the recovery of the firearm. The transition from the cold, sterile environment of the interrogation room to the physical reality of the crime scene and its aftermath is a shift from the psychological to the tangible. While words can be retracted or debated, the silent testimony of steel and lead remains immutable. Following the incriminating statements provided by Jenna Strouble, The Will County detectives understood that their case required a physical anchor. They needed the instrument that had shattered the peace of that Monday morning in Crete Township. The search for the weapon was not merely a procedural necessity. It was a hunt for the final, definitive link between the suspect and the 3 lives lost on that driveway and within that quiet home. The recovery of the firearm was the result of a meticulous coordination between the Will County Sheriff's Office and their counterparts in St. John, Indiana. Investigators focused their efforts on the 8-mile corridor between the scene of the tragedy and Strauble's residence. It is often in these quiet, unremarkable stretches of road where the remnants of a crisis are discarded. But in this instance, the recovery was a testament to the swiftness of the initial response. When the weapon was finally secured by officials, it was handled with the reverence and caution that forensic science demands. There is a specific, heavy silence that accompanies the discovery of such an object, a realization that this small, cold piece of machinery was the catalyst for an unfathomable amount of grief. Once the firearm was in the hands of the forensic technicians, the technological twist of the investigation began. Ballistic science is a field of remarkable precision, rooted in the understanding that every firearm leaves a unique fingerprint on the ammunition it discharges. As the firing pin strikes the primer and the bullet is forced through the rifling of the barrel, microscopic grooves and striations are etched into the metal. In the lab, technicians compared the shell casings recovered from near Jacob Lambert's car and the first floor of the Forde residence with test fires from the recovered weapon. Under the magnification of a comparison microscope, the truth became visible. The unique markings on the evidence cycles matched the test fires perfectly. This ballistic match transformed the investigation from a series of theories and statements into a scientifically verifiable fact. We see here the convergence of human error and technological certainty. It was no longer just a matter of what was said in a recorded interview. It was a matter of what the physics of the crime itself revealed. The firearm was linked directly and inextricably to the triple homicide, providing a level of forensic certainty that left little room for ambiguity. For the investigators and the surviving family members, the recovery and matching of the weapon provided a profound emotional beat, the feeling of a final puzzle piece clicking into place. In the chaotic aftermath of such a violent event, the world feels disordered and nonsensical. The presence of clear, physical evidence acts as a stabilizing force. It restores a sense of narrative order, proving that even in the darkest hours, the truth has a way of surfacing through the diligent application of science and law. This recovery was the bridge to closure. It allowed the focus to shift from the who and the how to the why, though the latter often remains the most difficult question to answer. As the firearm was logged into evidence, sealed away in a climate-controlled room, the weight of the investigation began to shift toward the legal proceedings that would follow. The instrument of the tragedy was now silent, stripped of its power, and transformed into a silent witness for the prosecution. The path toward justice was now paved with more than just testimony. It was reinforced by the undeniable reality of forensic proof. Not long after the lab results were confirmed, the various agencies involved began to reflect on the seamless cooperation that had made this rapid recovery possible.